Hello, everyone. For those of you who are not familiar with me, my name is Gabriella Hoffman. I'm a freelance columnist with townhall.com. I'm a media strategist, and I am most recently a Young Voices contributor, and I just signed on to be a visiting fellow with the Independent Women's Forum. But independent of that, I'm going to largely focus this live stream. I'm going to see if this is a good working model and see if it fosters more engagement and discussion relating to current events. So bear with me as I try to tinker with this type of live stream and see if it could be effective going forward. So share with me where you're following from. I would love to hear your feedback. I would love to know where you're coming from and chime in as well. So for the last week, we've been following here closely in the United States the protests that have erupted in Cuba. Peaceful protests to topple their communist dictatorship that has befallen the nation, the tiny island nation about 90 miles off of the coast of Key West in Florida for 62 plus years. And why is someone like me, who's not Cuban, concerned about this, very sympathetic to the aims of the Cuban people in finally getting freedom back in their country? I happen to be a child of immigrants who fled the Soviet Union. So to me, it is very personal to see other countries that have also been similarly plagued with communism and collectivism and central planning to get their freedom back as well. So I kind of have a selfish interest in seeing that. And from a journalistic standpoint, I was very disappointed by the coverage that I saw from other members of the media in downplaying the significance of these different protests that are happening. And good reporting that came out here in the United States and a little bit abroad was that this is the first time in about maybe 20 some odd years that a protest like this erupted that could spell really good news of maybe portending and maybe forecasting the finally timely end to the communist dictatorship that is befalling Cuba. So without really brushing so much into history, basically the Castros were in control of Cuba for many, many years. They recently put in a puppet who's no different, and his name escapes me right now, but the current leader of Cuba isn't really an improvement on the dictatorship that the Castros, first it was Fidel Castro and then his brother Raul, that they instituted. For many, many years, the Cuban regime was propped up by the Soviet Union, which my parents had to endure, and millions of others had to endure. So no surprise to see that Russia then, and even Russia today, and China even, with China controlling the VPN of Cuba, having an influence over this. This is why Cuba is a communist nation. Anyone suggesting the United States is to blame for what is happening in Cuba, that we're the ones who installed this communist regime, or if the embargo is largely to blame for what has happened in Cuba, they are greatly misinformed. So I'm going to read for you guys a little bit of my town hall column, and I will encourage you to read it for yourself if you're interested. So it's called Viva Cuba Libre. It's not hard to denounce communism. Really isn't. If you revile National Socialism or Nazism, the right and moral thing to do is to condemn its cousin, communism, no matter the stripe or the strain that it is. And what I wrote here at my town hall column today begins like this. Communism has killed over 100 million people globally. That is true. Sadly, it lives on today in Cuba. For 62 years, Cubans have suffered tremendously under it. They aren't protesting COVID vaccine shortages. They're protesting central planning. They're shouting Libertad and waving the American flag because they yearn to be free, have representative government, and to finally own private property. Independent journalists, if you guys didn't know, are being arrested and detained. Freedom activists are disappearing, and a few have been murdered, according to different reports out there. Yet some here in the United States are convinced that socialism is good. Shameful. I wrote kind of my lead and then kind of my kicker as being this. It's long overdue for Cuba to be free. A united global front opposing communism can propel them to reclaim their independence. And I fully believe this. I think we've done a terrible job of educating people in this country about the horrors of communism. I don't simply say this out of my frustration as a child of Lithuanian immigrants who came here, who experienced it firsthand. My grandparents largely were victimized by Stalin's regime. And even post-Stalin, my parents had their share of discrimination, religious persecution, and other restrictions placed on them. And it really is long overdue to hear people in government, to hear the media and others finally resoundingly condemn communism. It's not hard. And it's also not the alarmist thing to do to point out the fact that this is still very pernicious and still very toxic in the United States today. And you guys probably had seen the mixed messaging that came out from the Biden administration upon the news of the Cuban protests. One of the acting assistant secretaries, Julie Chung, had tweeted that peaceful protests are growing in Cuba as the Cuban people exercise their right to peaceful assembly to express concern about rising COVID cases, deaths, and medicine shortages. We commend the numerous efforts of the Cuban people mobilizing donations to help their neighbors. If you've been asleep for the past 60 years or however long you've been alive, the Cubans are not protesting shortcomings. There have been blockades. The regime has been really adamant about keeping policies in place that promote food rationing, very subpar healthcare, limited freedoms, no internet access for many decades. And to downplay the fact that they're finally advocating for freedom by saying, well, it's because of the pandemic. You're really not understanding that. So that was extremely tone deaf. And shortly after her statement, or a statement by one of those staffers who put it on her behalf, President Biden similarly issued a statement saying to the effect, we stand with the Cuban people as they bravely assert their fundamental and universal rights, and as they call for freedom and relief from the tragic grip of the pandemic and from the decades of repression and economic suffering. Unfortunately for the president, his statement falls flat to anyone who is following this issue closely or very keen on what is happening in Cuba. Instead of just simply calling it repression and economic suffering, he had to be specific. He had to point out it was Cuban communist repression and economic suffering. That's what's causing this. It's not the United States. It's arguably not our embargo. And it's the Cuban regime. Who controls them? Cuban regime. Who's oppressing them? It's the Cuban regime. And the fact that this was not communicated clearly was disconcerting to people like myself. So I had to point this out. And something that equally troubled me as a daughter of refugees who came here at the height of the Soviet Union. My parents, I believe, were recipients of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which helped Soviet emigres resettle in the United States on the condition that non-market economies like the Soviet Union would allow immigration from the country. So the political asylum program, I support it. I think it should be executed as it intended. It shouldn't be politically lumped in one way or another. It shouldn't be ruined or compromised. And hearing the statements from the DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, who himself was born in Havana, Cuba, oddly enough, saying that those who are fleeing Cuba or Haiti, wanting to get political asylum, will be rejected and essentially sent to third world countries or to countries outside the United States. And this is an excerpt of his statement. And if you're interested, I can link it for you guys. He said, "To those who risk their lives doing so, the risk is not worth taking. Allow me to be clear. If you take to the sea, you will not come to the United States. Any migrant intercepted at sea, regardless of their nationality, will not be permitted to enter the United States." How hypocritical and tone deaf is that statement? So it goes to show that they prefer people to come to this country by illegal means versus those who want to apply for asylum legally and follow the rules to come here, even fleeing persecution. They don't want to jump through hoops. They want to follow the process. So those who want to come to this country on legitimate grounds of asylum, they're not going to be turned away, and they're ignoring what is happening at the border. That's an aside. But to me, that's really insulting, and shame on the DHS secretary for this really tone-deaf statement, and especially for him being a Cuban refugee himself. It's very disconcerting to see that. What was also very interesting to me, we saw rappers like Pitbull issue resounding condemnation of what's happening with the Cuban regime over a lot of Democrat politicians. Very amazing, isn't that? So Pitbull essentially put out a video recently. I'm not going to read it verbatim so much because he did have a few curse words, and I want to avoid using colorful, flowery language for YouTube to keep this safe for everyone to listen. But he essentially said this, and he's also Cuban American, I might add. So Pitbull knows how to expose the problems with communism a lot better than many of our politicians, especially those on the left. So he said, "This is a message to the world. We need to stand up, step up, and if you don't understand what's going on, you need to wake the F up." And it gets me hot. It bothers me. It frustrates me to a certain extent, being a Cuban American and having a platform to speak to the world and not being able to help my own people, not being able to get them food, and not being able to help them get water, not being able to help them get medicine, he added. And most of all, not being able to help and really get them what they deserve, which is freedom. So I think if you're really on the fence about how to condemn communism and how to show support for what the Cuban people are doing in their country, take a cue from Pitbull. And also, Governor Ron DeSantis issued a great statement encouraging action by the United States. Hopefully, the Biden administration takes his suggestion to heart. And actually, there is discussion, and there was a development from Senator Marshall Blackburn about this, about a internet company that was able to use open source referencing to give internet access to the Cubans, which was shut off by the Chinese-owned, reportedly, VPN that was currently in effect. But according to Senator Marshall Blackburn, they were able to kind of overcome that hurdle. Governor DeSantis wrote something of that effect, and maybe the Biden administration will listen. And we had groups like Black Lives Matter blame the United States for what is happening in Cuba, which is lamentable and very disconcerting. And actually, a professor at the University of Pennsylvania who focuses on Romance languages, Odette Casamayor Cisneros, she had condemned Black Lives Matter in saying, "I am Black and Cuban and deeply hurt by the BLM statement on Cuban protests," she offered. "They are blind and deaf to the Cuban people, to their demands. With whom is their solidarity? Certainly not with the people in the streets. Listen to us." And regardless of where you fall on the embargo issue, because I know people have different perspectives. Some people think that lifting the embargo is going to lead to better situations. Some people kind of take both the positions of condemn the regime plus also lift the embargo. Some people are sympathetic with the regime and they believe the embargo has to be lifted. Some of us hold the view that maybe the embargo is not as bad as reported, and we also have to condemn the regime. But the Heritage Foundation, I know, considered the source, but it was really interesting, and I had to include this in my column. The truth about Cuba's economic destruction was caused by the regime's ruinous economic activities, specifically Castro's command economy based on a 1976 constitution and laws which prohibit private enterprise and ownership of property, completely destroyed the free market in Cuba, hindering economic growth and prosperity. In that same report, it reported that the Soviet Union had dispersed over $7 billion in subsidies and aid, and none of that money was felt and encountered by the people there. It was kept by the regime. Not surprisingly, they were all in sync with one another, but people were still very relatively poor. Commerce has been happening in Cuba with European countries. They're not losing out from not trading with us right now until they start to respect human rights. That was the condition of the embargo, that human rights had to be respected. People had to gain the right to vote in order for the United States to trade. And actually, the Biden administration just a few weeks ago reaffirmed their no vote on lifting the Cuban embargo, interestingly enough. So interesting position that they took there. Now I want to play you guys a few clips from both the White House press secretary and also President Biden resoundingly condemning communism. The first clip is from Curtis Hawk, and he is with the Media Research Center, and he took this from ABC. So I'm going to play it for you guys.
Now that you've had a few days to think about it, does this White House still think the protests in Cuba are happening because people are upset about a rise in COVID cases there, or is there some thought maybe given to the possibility that they are protesting because they are sick of communism?
Well, Peter, first I would say communism is a failed ideology, and we certainly believe that. It has failed the people of Cuba. They deserve freedom, deserve a government that supports them.
Interesting phraseology. The polling and the backlash that likely would have ensued had they not clarified their statements probably would have been of galactic proportions. So I'll give credit where credit is due. If this is sincere, kudos to them. But it should not take backlash from the American people to put out a decisive message on this. And now I'm also going to plug in what President Biden said of this. He similarly echoed her. And here's what he said on the issue as well. And this is from the Daily Caller.
Fail system. Communism is a failed system, universally failed system. And I don't see socialism as a very useful substitute, but that's another story.
If he was very genuine in his statement, that's a pretty damning thing, especially for members, far left members of his party, for them to hear him say that. So there's going to be some friction in the Democrat Party as a result of this statement, but I don't know why it took forever to say this. The fact that, like I said, education about communism's horrors is improper in this country befuddles a lot of us. But hey, kudos to the president. I don't largely support him. I disagree with much of his policies, but if he can be genuine and sincere and not follow the footsteps of his former running mate, President Obama, in possibly helping Cuba somehow in this manner and being sincere and encouraging U.S. support for the freedom efforts there. All of us can put aside our political differences, but, actions speak louder than words. So it remains to be seen. But two very interesting statements condemning and denouncing communism after a few days of mixed messaging and different types of backlash coming. So that was something I wanted to cover with respect to this. And before I leave you guys, I want to talk about a few books you should check out. It's not enough to base things anecdotally from my family story. I can tell you all about what my grandparents went through, about my grandpa's imprisonment in one of Stalin's gulags, which is valuable for contextualization efforts. But it's really important not just to simply listen to testimonials of first-generation Americans like myself, or directly from those who escaped persecution and imprisonment and saw the ills of socialism and communism firsthand. But some great books you guys ought to check out. One of them is a historical fiction book. This is a best-selling book. It's a great young adult novel. I normally do not recommend young adult novels, but this is by Rūta Šepetytė, and she is a Lithuanian American, so I'm of that tribe as well. And this became a bestseller. This, I think, came out in 2011. And for those of you who want just kind of a basic introduction to what happened in the Soviet Union, especially in the Baltic states, which does not get a lot of coverage, and understandably, people talk about Poland and they talk about Czech Republic and other countries that are bigger. But the Republic of Lithuania was actually the first country of the 15 occupied nations under the Soviet Union to break away. And I'm going to talk about more of that very, very soon. But Between Shades of Grey was also made into a movie called Ashes in the Snow to remove any confusion with the 50 Shades of Grey series and film adaptation. So Between Shades of Grey, if you have young kids who want to learn the basics, this I think is recommended and required reading in many schools. Like I said, it was made into a film in the last few years. It's done very well. Rūta Šepetytė also writes a lot of historical fiction novels about different instances in history. She also wrote about Franco's fascism for one of her most recent books. She's also written about The Salt in the Sea, another book kind of melding different themes that she established here about what happened in Prussia, Lithuania, Russia, and I forget the other regions in the book. But this is a really good book where it touches on the surface. It doesn't really go into the horrors that much, but you get to learn about the horrors from kind of a novel standpoint, and then that'll probably foster your curiosity to want to learn more about the horrors. But this is an excellent book, a great starter book to get people to absorb the concerns, absorb the horrors, and learn about what actually happened, and from a Baltics perspective. I'm kind of biased in this, like I said, because I am of Lithuanian heritage, but it's an excellent book. Something I also want to talk about relating to, if you want to learn about Stalin and the United States, we had a relationship with him. Our country was aligned with Stalin during World War II. And what Stalin did ahead of our alliance with him, in 1939, there was a Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which essentially led to the rearranging of Europe into different spheres of influence. So Stalin and Hitler divided and bastardized Eastern Europe by dividing it into different spheres of influence. So Lithuania went into, and many countries that were in what is called the Bloodlands, went into different spheres of influence. So Lithuania went back and forth between being occupied by the Nazis and the Soviets, and same with other countries that were also caught up in this really crazy system and deal. And one book that I would recommend on that subject would be Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder. He's a professor. I disagree with him on American politics. For the most part, I think he's a little out there when it comes to things. He certainly leans more to the left, in my opinion. But his book on the Bloodlands is exceptional reading for you to understand what was happening under both regimes, not just communism, but also Nazism, and how actually the two of them, despite some of their stark differences, were actually very similar in how they oppressed their people, and how both of the dictators had a lot of similarities and their goals. So that's one book. Also, another book by the late M. Stanton Evans, who was one of the foremost reporters in the United States. He talked about how there were Stalin secret agents in the FDR government. This is not conspiratorial. I'm not pushing any information out there to inflame or to peddle in conspiracy theories. This is a well-documented research book. This was M. Stanton Evans' last book before he passed away tragically from cancer. If you want to learn more about the machinations, about what our State Department did actually to embolden, if you want to know actually why China is inclined to communism today, why it was inclined to communism in the past, we actually had implemented some policies with encouraging the toppling of certain leaders and encouraging the installation of Mao Zedong into China and just other things. So this book is a great primer into learning about that kind of very dark history and some of our influence into that, unfortunately. And Herbert Romerstein was also a really good historian. These are legitimate folks. Again, a very serious book. If you want to learn more kind of from the governmental standpoint, that's something you can also learn. But also Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder is also something to read as well. Relating to China, this was published in 2015. I really found it to be an indelible read. It was really heart-wrenching. So this is A Heart for Freedom by Chai Ling. And she did a lot of activism against China's one-child policy. And she talked about the CCP, what they do, how they encouraged citizens to only have one child, how you'd be penalized if you have more than one child. She also talked about the rise of Mao Zedong and the CCP in China and offered that history. So I found it to be a really informative read. And if you want to kind of just learn about the basics that broach the subject of the CCP and why it is the way it is today, this is a great book to read. If you want to learn more, here's the cover. And a book that I have not finished in its entirety. And again, there's so many other books about the horrors of communism. I need to do more to read as well as a journalist, because it would be a poor thing of me to just, mouth all these different things but not have backing. But I'm really research minded, and I really am keen on encouraging people to have details and be detail oriented. So this is the granddaddy of them all about communism all across the world. Why that over 100 million victim figure is used is because of the research conducted by these Harvard-aligned professors. This was published in the year that I was born in 1991. This is called The Black Book of Communism, Crimes, Terror, Repression, and it covers how communism plagued and destroyed different places all across the world, not just Eastern Europe. It was also in Asia, Africa, Latin America, South America, the Caribbean, and many other places. So this is an essential reading material that you have to have. It's a little thick. I haven't finished through it, but in the reading I've done of it, harrowing stuff, scary stuff, even stuff beyond what I knew about the different regions. And like I said, I'm very familiar with what happened in the Soviet Union because my family lived it firsthand. And I am trying to do my best to educate myself even more beyond just hearing from personal testimonials. And hearing from personal testimonials is important. I think kind of something that refugees from the Soviet bloc or from escaping the CCP and other regimes in the last century and even recently, unfortunately, we didn't do a very good job right after the physical collapse of the Soviet Union to have people who experienced this firsthand tell their stories. Understandably, from what I know, even in my own family, some of my family members were not comfortable speaking about the horrors. My dad is not shy about talking about it, so we're going to have him come on YouTube a little bit more and maybe some podcasts. We're going to largely, I think, focus on a series coming up. And I think it's going to be important to hear firsthand from people who lived it and also to back it up by documentation as well. And people who survived the Holocaust survivors were really instrumental in educating people to leave in their minds, never again. And even Holocaust education is starting to lose out to misinformation and disinformation, which is unfortunate and lamentable. So Soviet horrors have to be treated in the same manner as Nazi horrors. I'm in full agreement with that. And I think we don't hear people talk about that largely enough. So that is kind of my spiel. I am largely in support of Cuba Libre. I am happy to defend them. I will defend them and write about what's going on in a fair and objective manner. Not going to obfuscate what they're going through, what their aims are. And I hope other members of the American media do this as well. Because if you misinterpret what is going on, you're going to create confusion and misinformation. And that is not healthy for understanding things that are happening and to obviously encourage people to reject this ideology. And people are surprised why this is happening after the physical collapse of the Soviet Union, after its demise, although I think the ideas of it are still alive, unfortunately. But what can be done essentially to curb this out? I wrote a town hall column about this, and I offered 3 recommendations so far. And it's going to be difficult. It's going to require everyone, right and left, no matter your geographic region, your socioeconomic status, to educate people about the horrors. But first and foremost, anti-communism or anti-socialism has to become bipartisan again. We can't just have those of us in Republican circles or in conservative circles just babbling on about how bad it is. That's going to fall on deaf ears. We need to reach the people in the middle and some on the center left who would be open to hearing this. We have to remind them of their anti-communist history. President Truman, JFK were pretty ardent anti-communists. They were both in support of containment. There were many Democrats, believe it or not, in HUAC, which was the House Un-Americans Act Committee. A lot of chairmen of that committee, however controversial that committee was, who were chairing that. Democrats were chairing it, and they were flawed individuals. Certainly, they were somewhat racist, but there were people in the American left who were ardently anti-communist. And there may be a few left out there now openly who are in that feeling. And I wrote in my piece that we have to encourage other Democrats who may be afraid to speak about the horrors of communism and socialism to speak out, because it would be really unfortunate just to see that party go really, really far to the left. And again, to defeat this in the public square and to get people to reject it resoundly, you need to have everyone working together, whether it is tackling critical race theory or cultural Marxism or beating back different interests out there in media who are whitewashing the crimes of the Cuban regime. It is really important to work together. I know it's going to be difficult. It's a very highly polarized time, but I have had interactions with people on the left who are pretty reasonable and moderate, who see their party shifting really, really, really to the extreme on this. And the fact that both Psaki and Biden had to put out statements resoundingly condemning communism goes to show that maybe there will finally be some pushback. I hope it's not just talk. I hope there's action to back it up, because statements that are not backed up by action have no teeth to them. And also, we have to make, in terms of anti-communism, and we have to kind of do it differently than maybe how it was perceived before, because there were some issues with it, with how it was communicated. But I think really important, and I've honed in on this in this discussion, we have to listen to survivors, or those of us who can communicate survivor stories, because I'm a child of those individuals who fled the Soviet Union, or my family fled communism, and there are many others out there who fled communism, or their kids can speak to the horrors as well. But unfortunately, that message is going to fall on deaf ears if we allow opportunists to hijack the message. So you want to make sure when you are hearing people talk about this, that the message and the messenger are in sync, and that it's not just someone looking to collect money, looking to start an organization off the backs of our stories and our family stories, because that's going to completely dilute the message, and it's going to be fodder for our media critics and our political opponents to use that against us. So we need to have a streamlined message. We have to have good communicators who have some proximity to the horrors, whether directly or indirectly, in my case, who can communicate this. And that's how we're going to be really effective in educating people about the horrors of communism. And also, change starts in schools. We see, like I said, movements building across the country to tackle and challenge critical race theory. We see school choice getting a second look and really building momentum across the country. Why not allowing and amending the curriculums all across the country to include education about the horrors of communism? Novel idea, right? I think so. And this has started to take place in several states, actually. So Florida being one of the first states, unsurprisingly, they've been doing a lot of phenomenal work. Governor Ron DeSantis signed into law a bill that would mandate, or rather encourage, the inclusion of anti-communist and anti-socialist education into the curriculum in Florida schools, and also to have people and students particularly hear from survivors of communism firsthand. So the testimonial component, in addition to including teachings about that, I think is a positive first step, because change happens in schools. Change happens in culture. So this could be a first good step. And also, a bill is moving in Arizona to offer a similar reform to curriculum as well. So I think those are three surefire ways to ensure that we can stem the tide of socialism and communism in this country. It shouldn't be a controversial subject. You see firsthand how Cuba is dealing with this. There's still examples in North Korea, Belarus, many other places across the country that are still toiling with this very pernicious ideology embedded in central planning policies. And we have to remind people of what toll it takes on people. What happens when you lose freedom? What happens when you don't have private property, when you don't have good health care, when you have socialized medicine, when you have food shortages and food rationing? That didn't work out well for people, and it resulted in millions of people dying because of this selfish notion that everyone has to be equal according to central planners, and their version of equality leads to the equitable sharing of misery. That is a lot to absorb. I hope this discussion, however long-winded it was, we covered a lot of things here. I covered a lot of things here, ranging from Cuba to general how to defeat socialism in the United States, or how to change perceptions here and even include other stakeholders and people who we don't traditionally work with. I hope it is informative. You learned a lot. You liked the books that I recommended, that you share with me books that you would like me to read and possibly check out that are legitimate. Please do not send me anything that is kooky or conspiratorial. I'm a very serious student of history, so I want things that I can read and that I could share with people that are legitimate. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to connect with me across social media platforms. Here on YouTube, you can scroll down to find all my social media channels and connect with me. We can continue the dialogue beyond YouTube. I hope you will be able to engage with me on this platform as I try to grow the channel. I would love one day to reach 100,000 subscribers, and I think I could be on my way to do that. And engage with me. If you have a tip, a media tip, you want me to interview political influencers, lawmakers, anyone that's interesting, making the news, share that with me, and I'll do my best to consider it. But keep everything appropriate, of course. And if you like hunting and fishing, I also cover that topic as well. You're going to see more about my fellowships, some projects I have coming up, my fishing adventures. We're going to have more interviews. Check out my interview with former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. And let me know if you'd like to see more of these live streams here on YouTube. Thanks so much for following. I'm Gabriella Hoffman. I'm a freelance media strategist, town hall columnist, Jill of all trades, and I really appreciate you all watching this and supporting the freedom efforts of Cubans nearby. Take care, everyone. Have a great weekend. Thanks for watching.